I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close Up. Today we're talking about the future of affirmative action, but first, it's being called the worst natural disaster in decades, the 7.8 magnitude earthquake that's devastated Turkey and Syria. As of this week, the toll surpassed more than 40,000, left more than 1 million people homeless. What's it like to live through an earthquake? Our first guest knows firsthand. He lived through one as a child, he's written about it, and we'll also talk about the political earthquake in Israel. Joining us, Bret Stephens, opinion columnist for the New York Times, Pulitzer Prize winner, former editor of the Jerusalem Post. And Bret, I want to talk first about seismic events in the Middle East, if we can. You wrote not long ago that Netanyahu is the Richard Nixon of Israel, but then you said it turned out to be deeply unkind to Richard Nixon. What's going on in Israel in terms of his attempts to clamp down on the judiciary, to cut the powers of the judiciary? Is this an attempt to appeal to his orthodox constituency, or is it an attempt to keep himself from being prosecuted?
The only thing mistaken in your characterization, Sam, and it's a pleasure to be with you, is the word "or." It's both, and it's an attempt to appeal to constituencies that have now formed part of probably the most right-wing coalition in Israel's history, including members who have criminal convictions in their history. Netanyahu has had legal troubles that he is, I think, trying to evade, in part through these efforts to essentially rewrite the way in which Israel's constitutional structure has existed for at least the past 25 or 30 years. Israel doesn't have a written constitution, so it has been an evolving situation. There's a third aspect that needs to be mentioned, which is that there are, in fact, legitimate reasons to complain about the scope, the breadth of the Israeli court's jurisprudence. It typically interferes in matters of law, and parliamentary systems like Israel's usually have a quality, of parliamentary supremacy. The problem is that in a country as small as Israel, the parliament is almost wholly controlled by the prime minister and his coalition. So there are no real checks on the power of the prime minister except for the Supreme Court. And the reason Israel, I think, is in such upheaval is that millions of Israelis feel that this effort to rewrite the balance or redo the balance of power would leave unchecked power in the hands not just of a party, but of a single individual, moving Israel to a kind of illiberal democracy on the, in the way that Hungary maybe isn't illiberal democracy. And that's why you have this remarkable surge of protest that I don't think is going to abate until some kind of compromise is reached.
We've always talked about Israel being the one democracy in the Middle East. If these changes go through, will it still be a democracy?
Well, it depends on how you define democracy. I mean, you could argue it will be too much of a democracy, right? I mean, we think about it, we think of democracy as a shorthand for liberal democracy, which is the rule of the people checked by rights of the minority and the rule of law. And the fear here is that what you'd have is the unchecked power of a very narrow parliamentary majority that doesn't even represent a popular majority. I'm confident the Israelis are going to figure it out. The country has gone through crises like these in its past, but these are momentous days for the state, and I'm very much on the side of the opposition in this particular case. This is using this is the wrong time to push the wrong measures on behalf of the wrong people.
Fred, you wrote about living through an earthquake. You were 11 years old in Mexico. You weren't sure what happened to your father. One of the things that I found fascinating about that moving piece is you're saying there really is no such thing as a natural disaster. What did you mean by that?
Well, there is, of course, such a thing as a natural disaster, but In the case of Mexico City, where I was a child in the 1980s, the natural disaster, which was an extremely powerful earthquake of magnitude of 8 or 8.1, was compounded by the shoddy construction, which ended up being the reason why so many people died in the disaster. So I remember going to downtown Mexico City a day or so after the earthquake itself. And one of the things that was most heartbreaking was to see buildings that were standing in place with no visible damage alongside shoddily constructed buildings, often shoddily constructed on account of corruption in the building process, that had been totally destroyed, totally pancaked, leaving people in the wreckage. The same is true right now in Turkey. People are being arrested. It's generally the case in lots of natural disasters that the real disaster is man-made. Not always the case, I should emphasize, but often the case.
And also, you said mismanagement in the aftermath of the earthquake.
Well, one of the things that I remember, even as a kid, was that in the early hours after the earthquake, or early day or so, the very nationalist government of Mexico refused foreign aid. It was seen as a sort of affront to national dignity to accept foreign aid. And those are the hours when there are people who can be rescued, right? You desperately need dog teams, people pulling, construction equipment, getting people out of the rubble. And the Mexican government stood in the way. It's good to see that the Turkish government is not acting that way. But clearly there's a tremendous upsurge of public fury, much of which will probably be directed at Prime Minister Erdogan and might have political ramifications down the road.
Bret, you also wrote a column recently talking about objectivity in journalism. Objectivity at a time when hardly any Americans, 16% of Americans, say they have a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in newspapers. Even fewer have a great deal of confidence in television news. How do we define objectivity? How do you describe objectivity in journalism?
Objectivity is an attempt to strip personal bias. In the narrow sense, it's an attempt to do everything you can to strip personal bias and point of view out of news reporting. Now, that's obviously very different from what I do. I write an opinion column. I'm paid to inject personal bias into my reporting while sticking to accuracy, fairness, the facts. And there's been a vogue in the last 5 or 10 years to claim that objectivity is not only an impossible standard to achieve, which might be right because journalism is a human enterprise, but not a desirable standard to achieve. I think if we go down that road, we will destroy what's left of the mainstream media's credibility. Our credibility rests on the perception, which has been a fading perception, that we're interested in getting the facts, as the Times motto goes, without fear or favor. And if the view, if the perception, if the perception takes hold justifiably, that that's not what we're doing, that we're essentially advocates and actors proposing certain, a certain point of view in our reporting, we're going to be off to the races. Every news organization is just going to be another version of Breitbart on the right or MSNBC on the left, and I hope we don't get to that.
We know where the line is that you can draw between fact and opinion, and that is your mandate. But what about analysis and interpretation? How does that work its way into a news story? One of the things that crosses the line sometimes in terms of objectivity that people on the left in particular complain about is the question of false equivalency, saying he said this, she said that, and we tend to let them balance each other out when in fact we kind of know one person is manipulating the facts or even lying. So as a reporter covering the news, how do we deal in a situation like that instead of just reporting one side saying this and another side rebutting it, instead of letting the reader know who, as far as we can tell, best is right?
Well, I mean, we used to be able to do this quite easily. And when I came up as a writer and as a journalist, we were told, show, don't tell. So I find a lot of adjectives now in the media claiming one side stated falsely X, Y, and Z. We should show a little more trust in our readers and their ability to sift through the evidence that we present. There are obviously cases in which if someone makes an outrageous claim and says it's a claim of fact, to demonstrate why that claim is wrong. For example, in claims that the 2020 election or some of the last midterm elections were stolen. But we also degrade our credibility with readers when we simply treat whole categories of people whom we don't like or who we think are mistaken as being misinformers or bigots or one thing or another. I think that writes out lots of people from the conversation that we're having. And I've always loved this Arthur Miller line that a newspaper is a country or a nation talking to itself. We help ourselves when we include more people in that conversation and we at least let them believe that their voice is being heard. Too often we've become a bit of an echo chamber, and when we get things wrong, it only further diminishes that credibility.
Did we learn a lot? I mean, we at the Times learn a lot from Trump's victory in his first election?
Well, I hope so, because that was a great example, and our former editor, Dean Baquet, was very forthright about this, that we were listening too often to people like ourselves or a class of experts, polling experts, political experts, who simply said Trump can't possibly win. And so we weren't listening to what was happening in a lot of the country. And that was a grave mistake. And it's an argument that when we talk about diversity in the newsroom, which is absolutely important, which allows us to hear from more people, more different sides of society, we should also think about viewpoint diversity. We should also have people in our newsroom who just don't share some of the generally left liberal presuppositions of the media class and can help readers and help other reporters and editors have a kind of broader and richer view of the national conversations that people are having, not necessarily within earshot of reporters whom they suspect of ill will.
But not to inject that viewpoint into what they're writing in news stories.
No, of course, never to inject the viewpoint, but to understand that it's out there, that these viewpoints are often valid, and that they help us collect information from more sources and provide our readers and our audience with a much richer picture of the conversations taking place in the United States. One of the things that's happened with media is that too many Americans just don't want to talk to us. They don't want to talk to us because they distrust us for one reason or another. Sometimes those reasons are fair, sometimes they're not, but it becomes problematic for any news organization that seeks to be a truly national and even global endeavor.
A quick last question. Marjorie Taylor Greene shouting out at the president during the State of the Union. We used to have duels on the floor of Congress. How much worse is this?
Well, I don't know if it's worse than a duel. I think if we go down to duels, then we're back to the 1850s and the eve of the Civil War, when that kind of thing did happen on the floors of Congress. There was someone who, I forgot the name, got beaten bloody with a cane on the House or the Senate floor. But it's a disgrace, and it's a sorry reflection of what's happened to too much of the Republican Party, that it's been taken over not just by populism, but by bad manners. I joked in my conversation with my friend Gail Collins, we might have a geriatric president, but he seems to have a prepubescent opposition, and that certainly can't be good for the country either.
Bret Stephens, op-ed columnist of the New York Times and Pulitzer Prize winner, thanks so much for joining us. And up next, the future of affirmative action. Affirmative action, a set of procedures designed to eliminate unlawful discrimination among applicants, remedy the results of prior discrimination, and prevent such discrimination in the future. This June, the Supreme Court will decide whether race-conscious admissions are constitutional following oral arguments heard in 2 cases last fall. Joining us is Emily Bazelon, staff writer for the New York Times Magazine. Her article explores the possible undoing of affirmative action. Emily, considering what states have already done, is there any affirmative action left in the United States?
The main vehicle for affirmative action in the United States is college admissions. And that's because of previous Supreme Court decisions, mostly in the 1980s, that have mostly eliminated affirmative action in hiring or contracting by the government. So there are sort of teeny slivers left in that domain, but for the most part, what the Supreme Court has left intact is the idea that a college can consider someone's race as a kind of plus factor in admissions. And that's what's now at risk before the current, more conservative Supreme Court.
Emily, Archibald Cox argued decades ago that the courts have interpreted the Constitution as saying schools should have the freedom to pursue the educational benefits of diversity in order to prepare students to live in a pluralistic society. What's changed since then?
Well, ironically, one thing that's changed is that we have research showing that, in fact, diversity does have educational benefits as well as benefits in employment settings. We know that when you have a racially diverse people, a group of people get together, you often see good problem solving. There's just more creative thinking that happens. And yet, this rationale is really one that the current Supreme Court conservative majority appeared to be quite skeptical of at the oral arguments in the current cases in October. So there's a kind of disconnect there where I think that the idea that racial diversity is a social good is pretty widely accepted, but it may be legally off the table come June.
Is that in part because affirmative action has sort of been a victim of its own success? It's worked so well that the court says, why do we need it anymore?
I don't think that's really the reason, because there is so much continuing need to address racism in our society. Like, we've hardly corrected for that problem. I think the main explanation is we have a much more conservative Supreme Court.
Mm-hmm. Now, one of the things you point out in the article that I found fascinating is some people say that affirmative action is reverse discrimination. But you say that when someone is denied admission because they happen to be white, for instance, they're not marked with the same sort of stigma as they would be as if they were discriminated against. How does that dynamic work?
Right. Well, that thinking about stigma comes from liberal justices of an earlier era, from Justice William Brennan, Justice Thurgood Marshall. And the idea is that while normally the court sets a very high standard constitutionally for allowing the government to treat people differently in any way on the basis of race, that in the context of affirmative action, where the idea is to remedy past exclusion by offering a kind of leg up, that in that context, it makes sense to think about race in a conscious way, because in fact, that's what the 14th Amendment was basically written to do. The 14th Amendment was enacted in 1868 to address the legacy of slavery. And so I think the liberal position here is trying to give voice to this notion that it's not enough to pretend there's an even playing field when throughout history people have been excluded and held back. That you have to take affirmative steps to really create equal opportunity. And that was the position of the liberal justices in the 70s, and I think may continue to be their position, but they may very well be writing in dissent.
Why is race such a lightning rod when we know that colleges, universities use so many other factors to admit and to exclude other applicants? Geographic distribution, gender, legacy, people whose parents, grandparents went to the college, people whose parents and grandparents contributed to the college, athletic scholarships and things like that. Why is race considered in a separate category?
I mean, that is a great question. I think that politically speaking, the answer is tied up in who benefits and who loses, and the quite limited appetite that we see over history that the white majority in America has had for anything that benefits people of color in a way that feels threatening to the white majority. So I think there's a kind of political answer. Legally speaking, the answer has to do with the Constitution and this very deep question about whether the Equal Protection Clause in the 14th Amendment is colorblind. In other words, can never take context or history into account, or whether there is room there to think about addressing the legacy of racism.
And what does equal protection mean when there's not equality in our society?
Exactly. That is the very deep question that has divided conservatives and liberals in the past on the court, and will probably divide them when we get a ruling, presumably in June.
Is there any quantitative way of saying whether affirmative action has worked or not, or is it a more qualitative judgment?
I think it's probably more qualitative. One of the reasons that affirmative action has continued until now was that in 2003, when the court got another really important case raising this question, there were these friend of the court briefs that were filed by top military officials and CEOs of major American companies. And they said, we need a pipeline of racially diverse, well-trained, well-educated talent in order to have our leadership reflect what America looks like. And so I'm not sure if that's a quantitative or a qualitative measure, but it's a powerful testimony to why these kinds of programs have been important in American life.
In fact, one of the places diversity has worked most effectively has been in the military.
Right. I mean, that's a really interesting and powerful lesson. And again, I think it has to do with this idea that America is, of course, a really racially diverse place, and that if you have a leadership that looks really different from the people who are serving in the military, that's going to be a problem for the military itself. And so what we see is a real effort on the part of the military to make sure that we have people of all races in these leadership positions.
What about the argument that giving minorities a boost in some way, giving them a slightly upper hand, affirms the notion, whether true or not, of some inferiority?
Right. So I think this is a tough question, and people have lots of different views about it. I'm going to answer as a woman who is sometimes invited to participate in things, probably because they're a group of men who are already invited, and they need a woman to kind of balance out what otherwise would be what's called a manel instead of a panel. And when I received those invitations, I could worry about my perceived inferiority, or I could just go ahead and participate because it's probably a good idea to have some kind of sense of representation there along gender as well as racially diverse lines.
Is there any middle ground here? I mean, if you were looking at it objectively or from 50,000 feet, is there any way to settle this, to deal with the ideological concerns about affirmative action, but also deal with the practical implications as well?
I think that in terms of constitutional law, this question of whether the Constitution must be entirely colorblind or can take history and the present and discrimination into account, that's a dividing line. Practically speaking, it is possible that universities will find ways that are, quote, race neutral to try to continue to have racially diverse student bodies. And what I mean by that is you can take into account neighborhood poverty level or the wealth of a family. And because in a lot of situations, being Black or Latino correlates with higher poverty levels, unfortunately, in this country, you can end up with a kind of racially diverse student body to some degree that way. So that may be a kind of compromise that emerges. Most of the experts I talk to think we will still see a drop, particularly in Black enrollment, even if there's an increase in the number of low-income people who are getting into highly selective schools. So there may be a trade-off there. It's really hard to say because universities haven't yet been asked to do it that way.
So it could be done by class, income, wealth, or some other form. New York Times Magazine staff writer Emily Bazelon, that story coming up this weekend. Coming up next, my thoughts on the sidewalks of New York. Before it was preempted by Kander and Ebb's New York, New York, the city's unofficial anthem was the Sidewalks of New York. It was composed in 1894 by a tap dancer and a hat salesman. They immortalized the city's pedestrians in waltz tempo. Try waltzing your way or tap dancing down the city's sidewalks today, or even walking. If the mayor hopes to make Manhattan more inviting to office workers and pedestrians, he might start with a supposed safety feature that sends many people crossing the street for safer passage. They're called sidewalk sheds, those cavernous plywood plank scaffolds erected on tinker toy steel struts at ground level when the facade of a building is being repaired or has found to be faulty. They defy the adage that what goes up must come down. The municipal law that mandated them made sense. It was supposed to protect pedestrians from falling chunks of brick, concrete, and terracotta, but the enforcement mechanism is, well, a mere facade. There's no muscle to force building owners to make timely repairs and then remove the sheds. Fines are too small. Inspectors are too few. The buildings department says it has begun cracking down. Landlords are required to install the sheds after a safety inspection or use them for routine maintenance. But many figure it's cheaper to leave them up after the work is done, if it's done, pay the monthly rental, and wait for the next inspection. As of today, 9,000 buildings are wrapped in those ugly wooden girdles. If the sheds were placed end to end, they would stretch more than 2 million feet or 400 miles, the distance from New York City to Buffalo. The composers of the Sidewalks of New York wrote about tripping the light fantastic. Today, the reality is, with all the obstacles, you're likely to trip in the dark. Fix the facades, shed the sheds. For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.